Thanks everyone for being here. So the topic is exactly what Roger mentioned. It's about cybersecurity regulations across the world. But this is not going to be a law talk. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a practitioner, and I want to raise awareness on why we have cybersecurity regulations today, and potentially why this is a good thing for our community. So I want to begin by putting back who I am. So I worked at ENISA. I set up the IoT security there. And now I created a company called Bencheton, where I work to actually accelerate project delivery. The main objective of Bencheton is to implement cybersecurity in IoT products and systems. So in this talk, the first thing I want to mention and to go back to are the issues with IoT security. There's a big lack of cybersecurity in IoT systems. We all know that. We will not be here otherwise. And I think it's a joke, but it's not a funny one. Then we will look at why regulations are needed and why we must prepare and how we must prepare to succeed, because they are here to stay. And in the end, I want to have a quick discussion around the current status of cybersecurity regulations in the world, and look at what can go wrong and what should be done to make it right. So let's start with the first part about IoT security. And we all know that. We all know what the S in IoT security stands for, right? You look at me and say, there's no S in IoT security. And then someone will say, yeah, that's the point. No, that's not the point. It is not funny. So for me, the S stands for stop making the same old joke. It's not funny anymore. Why is it not funny? Because IoT systems are used now to track our kids, to monitor our kids, to attack our families. You all know the Kayla doll, you all know the GPS watches. They've been used to actually spy on our children. Last year, 2 years ago, sorry, a family in the US was hijacked, and some stranger talked to a kid, a 8-year-old girl, and started harassing the family. Last month, we even saw that baby monitors now can be hacked through the internet. So I'm sorry, we don't need IoT security? Yes, we do. Think of the children, but also think of our safety. We have on the left a deep fryer, an air fryer. That could be hacked. The Nest, it's a thermostat. Regularly, you have issues with cloud systems, and the Nest system stops working. There was an issue in 2016, 2015, I don't remember exactly, where people were stuck in a blizzard in the US and could not even put the heating on. How about smart locks? If you look at the issue with smart locks, anyone could enter into your house without issue. That is not normal. So we want to secure IoT to protect our safety. We also want to protect our privacy, because there can happen. You remember this big hack where someone managed to show that a big vendor actually had a backdoor to spy on their customers. We are not this little kind of voice assistant, so I'm not naming it, but they've been exploited not only to spy on you, but they've been exploited to actually hack your smart home. So someone could actually shout through the window or do a Zoom call like we're doing and tell your voice assistant to perform some action, like buying some stuff on a big website. They also managed to exploit Zigbee light bulbs. They managed to exploit Zigbee light bulb with a drone, hijack the connection with the hub, and compromise a Windows PC. Last but not least, all these little assistants for your health, to monitor your healthcare, to monitor your heartbeat, have been hacked. Not only the device themselves, but the data they store in the cloud. And lately, this one, Fitbit, to name it, has lost about 60 million records. So think of our privacy. That's why we need regulation. We want to protect our privacy. But we also want to think of our developers. We want to think of our product manufacturers. They are creating innovation. They are creating new systems, and they are not helped. They are not helped because they are in a world where they are using dependencies which are insecure. They are using even dependencies that are probably not controlled by anyone. This is open source, or they're using dependencies that are 20 years old. So all these different examples show that it's really difficult for them to know what to do. So we need to secure not only IoT devices, but the entire ecosystem, which means the cloud, the mobile applications, and the dependencies. Last but not least, we all know Mihai. That's why we started looking at IoT regulations. Mirai was a big hack that disrupted a lot of websites, including Amazon, including Reddit. And this used actually default passwords. And this was the start of IoT regulations. We'll talk about it a bit later. But Mirai was in 2016, 17. Last month, 2 months ago, there was another botnet called Meris that exploited this kind of router. And that was used again to disrupt the economy, to create DDoS against big websites, to ransom companies. So yeah, we live in a digital economy and IoT is here to stay. So let's secure the IoT to protect our digital economy. So this is my intro to why we need IoT security. And as I said, it's a joke and no one's laughing. So what can we do? We've been working in that topic for years, and every year it's the same. We have issues, we have solutions, but no one is doing it. Why not? Because they don't have to. So my take at that is, how do we secure IoT? If I tell you don't buy IoT, you laugh at me, and I agree. We are all here to create secure IoT systems, but then a lot of people can say, change your password. Okay, I'm changing my password, but there's a backdoor with an admin account. I cannot change that. Patch your devices. If you look at the IoT ecosystem, you have a lot of devices which will be unsupported after a year or 2 years. Sometimes you acquire devices and the company doesn't exist anymore. So what do you want to patch? Use multi-factor authentication. Yeah, superb. You will try to use multi-factor authentication, but a lot of people don't want to use multi-factor authentication. It's not convenient. And it only works for cloud services. A lot of IoT systems are not connected to the cloud. They can work in isolation. Less and less, but this is still the case. Or get a VPN. I don't agree that a VPN is a good solution. It would secure communication, but it will not secure the device itself. This one is very, very complicated. A lot of people tell you to get a dedicated network for your smart home devices. This is coming from the industrial world, where it makes sense of separating use cases. But in a smart home, when you have consumer IoT devices and you put them on a dedicated network, they may not work as expected. On top of it, you need to have a lot of money to buy a new router, and you need to be tech savvy to configure this router. Last but not least, blockchain. I'm not going to go into the debate whether it's good or bad. I have not seen any use case of blockchain to secure IoT. So for me, we need to stop looking at technical solutions. We need to go a degree higher. And for me, and more probably for you, the degree higher is regulations. So why do we need regulations? When I started working in IoT security in 2014, I was against regulation. I was working at ENISA. We were trying to make the market, to support the market, support private sector, to make sure they would be able to create innovative solutions. And regulation at the time was seen as a blocker. However, after a few, let's say, failures of enforcing security, we saw that there was a lot of people blaming users. If you got hacked, this is your fault. You should have done this, you should have done that. But we cannot blame users who are buying a system, who are trying to install a system that should work as expected, and that gets hacked because there's a backdoor or because there's a lack of encryption. So the first thing we need to address is this root cause. We should not blame the user. The second thing is we need to address the root causes of IoT security. The lack of standardization at the time, the lack of security by design, the lack of information exchange, all this was not here a few years ago. The third thing is we need to nudge corporate investment. Who is making IoT products? Manufacturers. But what is the goal of a manufacturer? Generate profits. So security costs money, which means we're not doing security if we don't have to. Of course, there are good manufacturers who want to do it because it's something that will help them. But most of the times, you need regulation to nudge this corporate investment. Last but not least, clarify best practices. If you look at IoT security guidance, there are so many, it is really difficult to know what to do, when to do it. So by having regulations, you can actually focus on what matters. And we're going to see how it works in the world. This is a quick timeline on why we arrived at regulation. In 2015, ENISA published this baseline requirement and asked to clarify corporate liabilities. I mentioned Mirai in 2016. 2017, we start seeing the first regulations in California and the UAE. So the UAE one is more telco regulation, but in California, they actually tried to address Mirai by banning default passwords. We had in 2018, I think, the first stepping stone to where we are today. We had the UK Secure by Design draft that started putting requirements that would actually become a standard, the EN 303645. We have also the EU that secured IoT and ICT system through certification. This is a voluntary scheme. And last year, we had the ETSI standard finally published, which actually helps consumer IoT producers to have a baseline to secure their systems at minimum. We'll see how it works very quickly. In 2021, we have a lot more attacks targeting IoT. So Kaspersky released a statistics last month, where in the first 6 months, we had double the attacks in 2021 than in 2020. So it's a bit worrying. 2022 will have some time for compliance because regulations are here and we need some time to comply. And for me, I think if we follow this path in a few years, we may have secure IoT, so, which is great, yeah? So how do we succeed at that? I looked at all the regulations in the world. So I may have missed some, but I made a panorama. And on this panorama, I try to present in dark blue all the regulations that are using a specific standard, and in light blue, all the regulations that are promoting the ETSI standard, EN 303645, which is actually a set of requirements for manufacturers to secure IoT before they release a product and after the product has been released. And without going into too much details, we can see these regulations are on almost every continent. They're in North America, South America, Middle East, Europe, Asia, Australia, Oceania, Africa, not really yet, but it may come. And we also can see that EN 303645 has been adopted by many as the basis of the regulation. So if we look at these 18 regulations, we have 9 regulations focusing on all IoT systems. And when they say all IoT system, it could be anything from consumer IoT, healthcare, smart TVs, cars, anything. 8 of them are more focused on consumer IoT, and they would extract healthcare, they would extract automotive. The one to be confirmed is actually Thailand, because I've not had access to the draft, but they are looking at that. Among these 18 regulations, 12 are mandatory, 6 are voluntary. And for these mandatory and voluntary regulations, we have 7 with a label or certification. This will give the assurance that the manufacturer has implemented and is following the principle of the regulation or the standard. But we have 10 with no specific assurance mechanism. The one to be confirmed again is Thailand. So based on the results, when you look at these regulations and when you're a policymaker, your first objective is to make sure this regulation is fit for purpose. And this is a study of all these 18 regulations. We have almost all the time baseline requirements. What are these? Usually they're based on risk assessment, threat modeling. They usually make sure that there is no default password, and they want companies to support IoT systems after release. So it's vulnerability management, disclosure, patching. So this should be the base for all IoT systems. And if you look at these 18 regulations, they actually all align with the standard, which is great. It means as a manufacturer, as a regulated entity, you know what to do. You look at the standard and you try to comply with the standard. 17 are looking at regulating vendors. 2 are looking at regulating end users. Doesn't mean you and me, probably means big entities like in the US. 2 are also looking at regulating retailers, which will not be able to sell IoT devices or IoT systems which are not compliant with the regulation. And 3, mostly in the Middle East, are also regulating service providers. So it's good having regulation. It's good having regulation that's fit for purpose. But if there's no enforcement, it is actually a waste of time. So how do we make sure this regulation is followed? 12 of these regulations are actually making sure there is an enforcement, which is either through third-party accreditation or access to market. So it means if you are not doing secure IoT, you cannot sell in our geographic area, country, or economic area. For the voluntary regulations, because it is not an obligation, there is a strong push towards labels and certifications. And this push is really, really smart because it's not mandatory. Like the Cyber Act in Europe, you don't have to do it. But if you do it, you have the right to display a stamp saying you are doing it and you are doing it properly, which means when a consumer has the choice between 2 products, they can compare whether they're buying something secure or they're buying something that has not been tested. Again, for this testing, there's a possibility of doing self-assessment. There's a possibility of doing third-party certification. So this is what we call level of security assurance levels. The stronger you go to the right, the more secure you can be, and the higher the degree of security you can give to your customers. So today, most of the regulations don't really go into how it's going to be deployed. There will be potentially specific agencies that will have to do this, but today it is very unclear on how it's going to be implemented. So there are the regulations, and now how do we succeed in making stronger IoT with this world of regulations? So I'm going to take the point of view of policymakers and manufacturers. Policymakers, some people like them, some people love them, some people a bit less. I used to be in a position where I was supporting these people. They're doing an extremely hard job because what they're doing is actually making sure they can improve our society through regulation without making it too hard for smaller companies. So when you, as a policymaker, try to design a regulation, the first thing is to future-proof the requirements. If you make the regulation very specific to a technology, it will fail. But you also need to have clear requirements that cannot be interpreted, because a lot of companies try to game the system. So among the clear requirements, for instance, you say, you must do a threat modeling instead of saying follow secure by design, which doesn't mean anything. I think today's regulations are quite good. Most of them are relying on international standards, either specific standards developed through ETSI or other accepted standards like ISO standards or IEC standards. There are also standards developed by NIST. And there are some very specific framework developed by Singapore, Japan, China. So this is how to make sure the regulation is drafted appropriately. But then it's about supporting the regulated entities. And in the UK, there's another regulation called the NIS directive, which is looking at securing operators of essential services. So critical infrastructure operators, which are in the energy sector, railway sector, maritime sector, airplanes, everything that is critical to society. And the approach was to create groups, working groups, with the operators and the regulator to decide what should be the base and what could be adapted according to the sector and according to the type of operator. So I think to succeed at IoT regulation, we need to have strong support to smaller entities, to entities which are potentially very, very, very innovative. If they're using AI, they will be regulated by AI. If they're using 5G, they will be regulated by 5G. So how do we make sure we don't give them too much work to comply with all the regulations they have to comply with? Last but not least, we want to have collaboration. We want people to make security in IoT. So if there's no enforcement, it's going to be difficult to make it happen. So we need strong enforcement. And for manufacturers, actually, it's not that hard in the sense you have to comply. So you need to have a specific governance to make sure you are complying, to make sure you have the people in-house who do it, to make sure you have testing in place, to make sure people are trained, and to have the technical means to implement the requirements of the regulation. So what are the must do for you? You must, first of all, train your people on the requirement and the standards. So, okay, what does it mean doing encryption within this standard? What does it mean securing the device or the system after release? Okay, I need to have this, I need to have that. You usually look at threat modeling and risk assessment. This is the base of all the regulations. So train your staff to threat modeling and risk assessment. Make sure this is updated. Make sure when you implement something, it is secure. And if it is secure today, you still need to verify it regularly because the threat landscape would evolve. And security for IoT system doesn't stop at release. That's, I think, a key message I want to pass here. The regulation doesn't stop at release. They cover the entire life cycle of the IoT system. So plan for post-release activities. We talked about vulnerability management, patching, there could be more. Last but not least, and that's been a strong push by NIST recently, documentation. Document your product, document the dependency used with SBOM, for instance, document security features for the installers, for the users, document as much as you can, because in a few years, when there's a vulnerability, you will need to know whether or not your products and which products are vulnerable. So some pro tips, I'm going to do some marketing here, but train your staff. We offer training, know what to do. I don't want to go too much into details, but today there's a lot of checklists. It's difficult. So I created this tool called FAST. It's free. It allows you to assess which requirements are applicable to your product. It's online, it's free, use it. So we know what to do for regulations. What are the next steps? And what could go wrong? The next step are standardization for verification. There's been a publication of the ETSI standard recently. There's been a lot of push on labels and certification. So NIST has published something yesterday, I think. Have a look at it. There's some labels already. There's been some work that have been postponed in the UK. There is also some methodology published by ENISA. Use it, read it, adapt it to your use case. But the more we progress and the more we will have mandatory regulations. So in the EU, we've seen there are two regulations. There's actually the Radio Equipment Directive, which is mandatory for specific type of devices. There is the Cybersecurity Act, which is a voluntary certification scheme. And there will be very soon the Cyber Resilience Act, which will actually make security as a key requirement to access the market. So it's not published yet. There's a lot of discussion around that, but this will make security an obligation. Last but not least, globalization. Today, we've seen this regulation apply per country or economic zones. There's a lot of gray areas here. So I suggest that we help these countries to adopt what works. So potentially we need to make sure there's harmonization across countries so that when there's a product developed for the gray areas, they're also secure. Because we talk about the digital economy and whether or not you're in a gray area, we're in a connected world.